webinar. This is the latest in a series of events that have covered topics ranging from citizens' rights, post-Brexit, Erasmus and Scotland's links with Europe, and you can find recordings of all of these on the European Movement in Scotland website. My name is Fiona Wishlade. I'm a member of the executive of the European Movement in Scotland, and in my day job at Strathclyde University, I take a keen interest in European affairs. So our topic or our question tonight is, do small states fare better in or out of the EU? Now, often EU news is dominated by what Angela Merkel or Emmanuel Macron's positions are on various issues, but these are only 2 of 27 countries. And among these are many small countries who often have considerable influence in EU affairs. On the other hand, some small European countries prefer to stay outside the EU. So what do the various experiences of these countries tell us, and what lessons, if any, are there for Scotland? Well, here to discuss these issues, I'm delighted to be chairing a great panel of speakers. We have with us Michael Mann, the EU Ambassador for the Arctic, Dr. Kirsty Hughes, Director of the Scottish Centre on European Relations, and Mike Keating, Professor of Politics at the University of Aberdeen. Welcome to everybody, and thank you for coming. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. We'll hear from all of our speakers first, and then take questions at the end. And could you put your questions, please, in the Q&A if you want to make sure they get directed to the extent that we have time. Put them in the Q&A box rather than in the chat box. It makes it a bit easier to find. So I'd like to ask Michael Mann to kick us off. Michael has been the EU Ambassador at Large for the Arctic and Special Envoy for Arctic Matters for the last year or so, I think. And before that, he was EU Ambassador in Iceland, and his previous positions include a raft of key communications posts in the European External Action Service and in the Commission. So a wealth of experience in dealing with a variety of countries, both inside and outside the EU. Michael, would you like to get us started?
Sure. Thank you very much indeed, Fiona. Thanks very much for your kind introduction and for inviting me to speak at today's event. Also, I'd like to wish a very happy birthday for yesterday to David Gow, who's an old and much missed friend to so many of us in Brussels. And I must say that it's very, very good to see the European movement so active in Scotland. Of course, as an EU diplomat, I welcome this very much. But I also have to admit that despite my accent, I also have a personal interest in Scotland's future. My mother was from Edinburgh, met my father at Edinburgh University, and that's where I also graduated from. So we go back a long way, myself and Scotland, and I wish you well. So now to today's subject. As Fiona said, I was lucky enough to be the EU's ambassador to Iceland between September 2017 and March 2020. So I'll, this afternoon, use the example of Iceland, which I guess is the ultimate small state, to try and answer the question that is asked in this webinar. Obviously, my presentation will necessarily be rather Iceland heavy, but I think most of the arguments I will make are applicable to small states more broadly. Another health warning before I start. Of course, as a good EU official and diplomat, I'm not officially allowed to have an opinion on whether Iceland should join the EU or not. That is, as I always had to say, a matter for the Icelandic people themselves to decide. But I'll attempt to give you the sort of pros and cons in any case. So when I got the job in Iceland, I expected to go to a place which was very well disposed towards the EU. After all, it had applied to join. It was already a kind of semi-detached member, if you like, through its membership of the single market, of Schengen, and of other EU agreements like the Dublin Convention on Asylum. But when I got there, what I actually found was a country with a strong sense of independence and a very strong, indeed dominant vein of Euroscepticism, which of course made my job as EU ambassador much more interesting than it otherwise would have been. So let me start with a bit of history and context before I try to answer the question of whether small states fare better in or out of the EU. Iceland is, although thought of as a small country, it's actually much bigger than Scotland physically. It's 103,000 square kilometres compared to 78,000 for Scotland. And yet its population is only 360,000 compared to, I think, 5.5 million in Scotland. So, however, despite that, and despite its small size, Iceland has always managed to punch above its weight. How has it managed this? First of all, it lies, of course, in a very strategically important position, precisely halfway between the European and American continents. It's actually, we have a volcano there at the moment because the two plates are moving apart. It's the European and the American continental plates that actually meet in the middle of Iceland. And of course, Iceland is at the entry point to the Arctic. Building on this, it's managed to perform, I think, what I'd call a very clever balancing act between the different powers that surround it. It's a member of NATO, even though it has no army. It's in the EU's single market through its membership of the European Economic Area, and it has long-standing good relations with Russia, and before that, the Soviet Union. In fact, in the 1970s, if you see a photograph of Iceland, you'll see that many people are driving larders, and in return, Russians ate vast quantities of delicious Icelandic mackerel. In 2013, Iceland signed a free trade agreement with China, and Iceland actually applied to join the EU in 2009 in the wake of the financial crisis, which had an absolutely devastating effect on the country's economy and brought people out in their thousands. There were many demonstrations, people bashing pots and pans to protest at what was going on. In 2013, Iceland suspended its talks with the EU. And in 2015, its then foreign minister sent a letter to the EU without the approval of Parliament, saying that it had withdrawn its application. The status of this application remains to this day in Iceland a very political hot potato. When I arrived in September 2017, the government programme of the three-party coalition included a commitment to hold a referendum before the end of its term on whether to resume accession negotiations. 2 weeks after my arrival, and I assure you the two things are not connected, the government fell and was replaced with a different three-party coalition of parties, all of which were opposed to EU membership. Now, rather like the Tory party in the UK, one party is the traditional party of government in Iceland. It's always in coalition, but the Independence Party is generally in most of the government coalitions. And I think the clue to Iceland's attitude to full membership of the EU is there for all to see in the name of this party, the Independence Party. Iceland applied for membership only when it was in the biggest crisis in its history for obvious economic reasons. Shortly after that, thanks to the great good fortune of the eruption of the Eyjafjallajökull volcano, I've learned how to say that after being in Iceland for a few years, in 2010, and some smart marketing, the Icelandic economy quickly recovered on the back of a major tourism boom. Indeed, before COVID struck, tourism actually contributed the most to Icelandic GDP ahead of fisheries, which was previously the mainstay of the Icelandic economy. So once the economy was back in shape on the back of tourism, enthusiasm for the EU quickly waned. And opinion polls now show a steady majority against joining the European Union. Now, why is this? Now, I think there are many reasons. Firstly, the very great importance of fishing to Iceland's economy and the perception at the time that EU membership and being part of the common fisheries policy would have an adverse effect on the fishing industry. Then there was the perception that EU membership would have a negative effect on Iceland's farmers. Like in most countries, the farming lobby carries an importance in Iceland which far outweighs its contributions to the economy and to employment. And of course, the Icelandic electoral system has a bias in favor of rural areas. Then there's Iceland's strong traditional ties with the US, which included significant economic, diplomatic, and military assistance, and that decreased Iceland's dependence on European countries. And then there was the tendency for Icelandic elites to go for higher education in the US or the UK and to cooperate very closely with the political elites from those countries. For example, the current Icelandic foreign minister is in the ECR group, his party's in the ECR group, and is close to many senior figures in the UK Tory party. And then there's the fact that Iceland only won its sovereignty from Denmark in 1918, and the union with Denmark was only ended finally in 1944 with the declaration of a republic. So Icelandic nationalism is strong, and there is widespread suspicion of joining another union. And I think perhaps its status as an island plays an important role here too, a little bit the same effect as we have in Britain. Then I don't know if you know of the ice save dispute, but the impact of the ice save dispute, I won't go into it, but this was about some of the financial products that had proved so disastrous in the financial meltdown. And that led to a dispute with the EU, the Netherlands and the UK. And that also left a big scar on Icelandic views of the EU. And since then, of course, since the referendum in 2016 in the UK, the Brexit discussion, as they're very close to Britain and read a lot of British newspapers, the Brexit discussion has also played into the better out than in narrative that tends to dominate. Yet despite all this and all the sort of negative views of the EU in Iceland, there is no doubt whatsoever that Iceland has gained massively from what I would call its hybrid semi-detached model. Without its membership of the single market and Schengen, the Icelandic economy would be unable to operate as it does. If you visit any fish factory, any construction site, or any hotel in Iceland, you're just as likely to hear Polish being spoken as Icelandic. In fact, I looked up the latest figures before writing my words today, and they show that 23% of the workforce in Iceland is foreign, and the vast majority of those are Polish. So given the results of regular opinion polls, the majority of Icelanders clearly believe that they have the perfect deal. In the single market, a ready supply of foreign labour, but maintaining vital bits of sovereignty and staying well away from the perceived evils of the CAP and the CFP. And pre-COVID, it was easy to believe that Iceland also enjoyed a very healthy economic situation. So are the Eurosceptics right? And I shouldn't exaggerate, there is also a big group of people who support the EU, but the polls show that the majority against joining is very much dominant and has been for many years. But would they actually be better or worse off fully inside the EU? So let's take a look at the arguments given by the Icelandic Eurosceptics. First, as a former Commission spokesman for agriculture, I can say from experience that national farming lobbies are always opposed to EU membership, but that their members are always amongst the biggest beneficiaries when their countries finally join. On fisheries, one could easily argue that the CFP did have its problems in the past, and that Icelandic stock management was better than what we did in the European Union. However, nowadays, the EU has learned from past mistakes and has a much better policy now, particularly in terms of conservation and not discarding unwanted fish. What the Icelanders also did not appear to accept was that fishing access under the common fisheries policy is based on the principle of relative stability. That means that future fishing opportunities are based on past fishing history. In other words, they in principle had absolutely nothing to lose. I also used to tell people in Iceland that despite the increase in qualified majority voting in the EU over recent years, there is an unwritten rule that states are never outvoted on fundamental issues of vital national interest. And that would obviously apply to fisheries in the case of Iceland. And in any case, any decision to change the basis of the CFP would need unanimity in the European Council, where Iceland would have a seat if they were a member. One recurring theme on the same issue during my time in Iceland was their regular demands for what they called fair access to the EU market for their fish. There were tariffs, there were quotas on some of their fish. Yet, I had to remind them that it was the Icelanders themselves who'd been so anxious to keep farming and fisheries out of the deal they had with the EU. And they themselves would admit to being reasonably protectionist on agricultural imports, as anyone can see anytime they visit a Reykjavik supermarket. So another key argument that I heard from a lot of Eurosceptics was that small states have no chance in the EU, that they are effectively bullied by the big states, that it's run by Germany and France and no one else gets a look in. The example they always gave me in this discussion was the example of Greece. Now, it's a controversial one, obviously, But the narrative was that the draconian bailout was forced on the Greeks purely to save the German banks. Now, everyone has a different view of this, but you can also point out to the vast sums of money that were pumped into the Greek economy, and despite the very difficult years that followed, the positive outcome of the bailout program. I actually preferred to point to the Brexit talks as the perfect example of how the EU in fact protects its smaller states. Throughout the Brexit discussions, the EU's overriding priority was protecting Ireland from the, I should say Ireland, not Iceland, protecting Ireland from the potentially disastrous effects of Brexit. And in that, despite differences they may have had, the member states remained united right until the end. Another disadvantage that no one can deny is that members of the EEA who are not members of the EU, such as Iceland, are rule takers and not rule makers. The EEA states, in other words, Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein, are able to give their views on single market legislation during the consultative phase, but at the end of the day, they're required to adopt EU legislation covering a huge range of issues without having a vote on what that legislation says. Not only that, but Iceland also pays into the EU budget via the so-called EEA grant system. This is money that goes towards improving cohesion in the poorer EU member states. And of course, as a full member, Iceland would have a seat at the top table in council, it would have a commissioner, and it would have some MEPs. And on the economy, appearances can also be deceptive. In fair weather, Iceland has prospered. But as the financial crash and the pandemic have shown, a country whose economy is based on a very small number of sectors is extremely vulnerable to events beyond its control. Now, Iceland is the second smallest country in the world to have its own currency, and the Icelandic krona is notoriously volatile. And for those in favor of EU membership, this is really the single biggest reason they would give for joining. And in fact, the same opinion polls that show a majority against EU membership often show a majority in favor of the euro. So people want to have the euro, but not be in the EU, which alas, according to our treaties, is not actually possible. The euro could be expected to bring lower long-term interest rates, which is a major issue in the Icelandic housing market, not least for first-time buyers, and it would increase capital investment and labour productivity. The euro could also be expected to lower consumer prices by facilitating a comparison with other euro countries. Now, I think my allotted time is probably up. I've probably talked for long enough now. I've focused on one country, though it may be perhaps the European small state par excellence. But one could also look at the obvious benefits enjoyed by the Baltic republics, for example, or Malta, not to mention Ireland, the ultimate Celtic tiger that has benefited enormously from its membership of the European Union. Now, obviously, every country is different, and Iceland has undoubtedly done well with its hybrid model of European cooperation, mixed with agreements with other major partners. Those opposed to EU membership would point to issues of sovereignty, control over their natural resources, and the importance of being able to act nimbly without referring to others. The pro-EU side can point to benefits in terms of economic stability from being in the EU and the euro, and the fact of being at the table when the laws are actually made. Now, as I said at the beginning, I'm not paid, unfortunately, to express an opinion. Sorry, I'm paid not to express an opinion on this, but I hope I've given you a flavour of the pros and cons, and you can probably guess what I really think in the back of my mind. So thanks very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Michael. That was very finely balanced indeed, and I think a lot of people will have appreciated the wealth of detail that you've given us about Iceland, which is not a country that we hear that much about that often. So that was absolutely fascinating. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Kirsty Hughes, who's well known to regulars at EMiS events. Kirsty is founder and director of the Scottish Centre on European Relations, and she's worked at leading NGOs and think tanks, as well as at the European Commission. She writes widely on Scottish and European affairs, including on Twitter. And of particular interest tonight is the report that she published last year, I think, on smaller states' strategies and influence in the EU 2027. That report is available on your centre's website, I think, and maybe it's some kind person might like to post a link in the chat for anybody who's not familiar with it already. So Kirsty, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Fiona. Good evening, everybody. It's great to be on this panel. Thank you to EMiS for organising it. I did indeed write this paper a year ago on how small states have influence in the EU, and I did that, in fact, as part of the University College London, their European Institute Jean Monnet programme. So you'll also find it on their site, and to acknowledge their support for that project. What I wanted to do before talking in more detail on some of the themes of that paper, about the questions Michael, in fact, was touching on at the end there, about how and do smaller states have influence in the European Union. I wanted to say something briefly about the choice between the EU and the European Economic Area, and I can perhaps be a bit more opinionated than Michael, given my freewheeling status, and we were indeed colleagues 20 years ago, although only for 2 years, so not stuck by Commission rules in what I say. But I think what's very interesting in brief on the European Economic Area versus EU question, and of course Switzerland rejected even the EEA and therefore has its own complex series of treaties with the EU to give it more or less access to the single market. But since the EEA was created and the single market was created, we know what happened. We know that 3 of the EFTA countries chose to join the EU at that point. So Sweden, Austria and Finland all joined, and Norway was going to join, but actually its public rejected that in a referendum. So we've had, since 1995, we've had 16 countries altogether have joined the EU. No new countries since you had Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein in the EEA have joined. So I think that probably tells you something in itself. And I also think Michael referred to the democratic deficit, and I think it's not only serious, but it is recognised. I mean, it's also debated in the EEA countries, but there was a report that I did a short article on, I remember, for the BBC website 9 years ago, a Norwegian big investigation into 20 years of the EEA, and it put a big emphasis on the extent and range of the democratic deficit, because there was so many EU laws and rules coming into Norway and being managed by different departments and officials and bodies. And if I'm remembering the quote correctly, it said, "Never have so many people known so little about so much." Knowing so little in the sense of it not being well coordinated. So that's just one point on the EEA. The other point, and I saw it was already in the Q&A, and it comes up a lot in the Scottish independence debate, is whether Scotland should join, if it was independent, the EEA and not the European Union. I've always argued, again, for some of the reasons Michael's already touched on, that it would be much preferable to have a voice and a say. And also when we see the damage done to the Scottish fishing industry by Brexit and by the barriers to the seafood west of Scotland, fisher communities and so on, it's not so obvious that the CFP is such a bad thing. And just one last point on that, I very much disagree with the idea that the EEA is somehow a transition route to the EU. It's an alternative to the European Union. If you want to join the EU, if you're independent, you put your application into the Commission, you talk to them about the transition route. You'd expect, like all the other candidates have done in the last 20 to 30 years, to negotiate a tailored association agreement. What you wouldn't expect to do is go to the EEA countries, and remembering that the 27 EU member states are EEA countries as well, and say, can we join you for a while, and then on the way to the EU. And I think obviously there are arguments, and they're more Eurosceptic arguments about the euro, and to some extent about fish and agriculture. That's perfectly fine to have an argument about preferring the EA, but I really don't think it's an accession route to the EU, and I think we need to be frank and honest about that. Let me say something then in more detail about larger and smaller states in the EU. I think that's a division, of course, that has been always with the EU. When it was first started 63, 64 years ago, it was made up of 6 countries, 3 large countries, France, Germany, and Italy, and 3 smaller countries, Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And now it's 27 countries, and the vast majority of the member states are smaller states. I also saw someone in the Q&A said, well, what is a small state? And I think, there's no particular definition of that. Obviously, it's a relative thing, but only 5 of the EU member states have a population over 20 million. And there's not that many EU member states that are much over 10 million. So there certainly is that imbalance. And it raises questions not just of power, but also of democratic fairness. What is fair? Is it fair to do it all by population, so the biggest dominate? Is it fair to do it all by national sovereignty, so that somehow all the 27 are absolutely equal? And of course, anyone who's looked at this will know that the current system of qualified majority voting in the EU, which is the most common voting and decision-making mechanism for areas where there's no veto, says you have to have a sort of double majority. You have to have at least 55% of member states voting for a new law or a rule, and that must be at least 15 countries, but you must also have 65% of the population. So I think, I think there's 2 extreme kind of caricatures almost of the EU, neither of which I would agree with. One says it's all dominated by the big countries, and France and Germany run everything. And the other says, oh no, it's all absolutely fine, and it's all a cozy consensus, and everybody respects everybody, and it's all fine. Well, there is real politics and real power in the EU. Politics doesn't disappear by being in the EU. It just goes in certain ways and dynamics. So I think we just have to accept this is quite a complex set of political dynamics in the EU, and not always driven by size, but size and protecting influence and power of the smaller countries has certainly been a recurring theme in EU discussions of how to develop democratic and effective decisions and operating mechanisms down the years. So I think if I was trying to sum up how smaller member states have influence in the EU, I think they do it in a whole variety of ways. And this is the paper I was doing a year ago. I did interviews with, I think, 20 or more interviews across a dozen member states to ask smaller member states how they actually thought about this, what they thought they did to try and have influence. So obviously they have the seat at the table. They're on the European Council, they're in the Council of Ministers, they have a commissioner, they're in the European Parliament, they have a vote, and where relevant they have a veto, and that's hugely important. And I think it's not been recognised much in the Brexit debate how much the UK has lost from not being part of that incredibly dense range of meetings and political and official roles. And when you think about even how the COP26 is being organised, there's a real loss of density in day-to-day contact, even though of course there will be contacts between the UK and EU member states on the COP. So I think on top of those formal structures that are extremely important, and discussions over how democratic they are and who's really got the most power is one thing, but there's also a huge amount of activity going on through alliances, through networks, effectively through lobbying. It may be quite funny in a way to think that Ireland or Finland is actually both at the table, but nonetheless also lobbying. But I mean, in a sense, all the member states lobby. In my couple of years working for a commissioner in the European Commission, I worked for the Employment and Social Affairs Commissioner. So of course you would have ministers coming through, you would have diplomats coming through from the UK, from Germany, as well as from the former states. So there's this whole multi-level thing going on about how states try to have influence. But I think the smaller states are especially aware that this is very, very important to them, because if they literally just turn up to the formal meetings and try and say their piece in a room of 27, that's absolutely not going to be enough. I want to say a little bit more about that, but I also just want to sort of reinforce something that Michael already said. I mean, he said that the EU tries not to overrule a country where a vital national interest is concerned. And I think it also more broadly, though I think this has got more difficult after the 2004 enlargement as the numbers went up and up from 15 to 28, now 27, but that if a consensus can be reached, if everybody can be kept on board in getting to a new law, that has always been the preferred solution, as long as it's not completely undermining the purpose of a particular law or new strategy. So I think of course there is raw big country power, and I might take a somewhat different view. You could have a whole panel, obviously, on the Euro crisis and how Greece was treated. But then that wasn't just big country to small countries, because if you remember, look how Italy was treated as well. So I think, yeah, that was a very dramatic episode, but it is only one part of the story. I think it was a particularly interesting moment for me to do that paper a year ago, because although, as I've said, there's always been this question of how do smaller and larger states balance in the it's not a federation, the EU, but the sui generis, partly confederal, partly federal EU. How do they balance their interests? And of course, one of the things people talk to me about a lot when I talked to them off the record a year ago was about Brexit, because these countries had all had alliances with the UK, and the UK had also, by being one of the big three member states, had also had a very important impact on how the larger member states exerted influence. And a lot of different member states, and you'll still hear them say that today, say, well, of course, there used to be a triangle. So it wasn't just that France might have one position here and Germany another position there. It was the UK would have another position somewhere else. And then smaller member states would also find it easier to decide where they really thought their interests were and who they could side with or lobby with, or perhaps lobby against. And so with the UK going, whether you talk to people in the Netherlands or Sweden or Prague or wherever, what I found again and again was that all these governments of member states and the officials were rethinking their alliances. The UK leaving as a big member state really kind of changed those dynamics. And, you know, we've seen the Benelux countries, of course, right from the start were thought of as Benelux. You know, that was already one small country grouping. When the Central and East European countries came in, you had the Visegrad Four for quite a while. Now you've got the so-called new Hanseatic League of some of the Nordic member states. And you've got a lot of more informal mechanisms, so-called like-minded groups that may last and be formalized more like the Hanseatic League or maybe one-offs, but you'll find like-minded groups of member states informally liaising, maybe writing a letter to whoever's running the EU presidency at the time and saying, here's our views on the single market, here's what we want to happen at the next European Council on climate change. You've got the Frugal Four who have come up every now and again in the news in the last year or two about the budget. And you've also, so you see a lot of things like that, and Michael's already mentioned Ireland, but I think Ireland has not only played an extraordinary and effective diplomatic game through the Brexit process, but it too has thought through, especially because geographically it's left in a very awkward position with the UK leaving. It's thought through both its global and its European alliances. It's put a lot of effort actually into building its relationship with Germany very effectively, according to some people I've talked to in Germany. There is a lot of this sort of thing going on, and there are also, I don't have that much time left, but there are also a lot of specific lessons I picked up from talking to these member states, smaller member states, off the record. They emphasized how much you have to engage. You have to engage with the issues, you have to engage with the different points of view, you have to be constructive. If you've got a problem with a new bit of legislation that's being drafted, you might go to the European Commission and try and get someone there to understand your problem. You might go to the rotating presidency, but you need to go and be as constructive as possible. You also need to go as early as possible, so timing is important. If you're asking other member states to support you on something, you obviously need to go in for reciprocity. So if you're Estonia and you're asking for understanding on something from Greece that's not even in your neighborhood, you might need to learn about some of Greece's concerns as well. And you also have to have a very good sense of your own priorities and how you're going to go around promoting those priorities. Because again, I mean, one big difference between bigger and smaller member states is simply the size of their civil service, their diplomats, and what they can realistically do. So I'm out of time, so I was going to say something about lessons for Scotland out of that, but I think I can pick up on that perhaps in the Q&A. I think what I take out of all that is that those people who say, oh, if Scotland joined the EU, it would only have 1.5% of the votes or whatever, you know, and it wouldn't have any say, and it would be a minnow, and it might as well be in the European Economic Area. I think that is quite misleading. It is extraordinary when you look at some of the power and influence that, you know, countries like Denmark and Sweden, their names come up regularly when I talk to people in the EU about who are the climate leaders, who are the climate influencers. So this is not simple, this is not straightforward, but actually it could be much more problematic than it is to have as small states as Malta and Luxembourg, medium-sized states like the Netherlands, big states like Germany. But actually, overall it works, and it does give everybody a voice. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kirsty. That was I think fascinating insight both into the work that you did, but also into the sort of like the balance between the weight, the sort of like physical or economic or population weight of a country as against the, you know, the opportunities to kind of exercise, you know, soft power and more subtle alliance building and so on. And yeah, be great for you to pick up those other things about the lessons in the Q&A in a few minutes. Okay, our final speaker is Mike Keating, currently Professor of Politics at Aberdeen and Edinburgh universities. Also spent a long time in the European University Institute in Florence and was head of politics there. He's also director of the ESRC Centre on Constitutional Change, where he's just co-edited a book entitled Scotland's New Choice, Independence After Brexit, which I think will interest a lot of people. But in this context, it's an earlier work that he co-authored on small nations in a big world, which is at least as relevant, and which looks at the experiences of Nordic and Baltic states and Ireland. So, Mike, the floor, or at least the screen, is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona, and thanks to the European Movement for the invitation. I just want to say something from what we know about small states from the academic literature, and then perhaps conclude on how this applies to Scotland, or could apply to an independent Scotland, but also applies to a more devolved Scotland as well. This is an idea that's really been around since the 1970s, when Peter Katzenstein published his book that's become something of a classic, Small States in World Markets, which really for the first time pointed out that small states can actually do quite well in a big world, in a free trading world, but under certain conditions, because at that time, or until that point, the orthodoxy had been that economies of scale and the needs of security meant that the future was for the big states, especially in the context of the Cold War. So Katzenstein put this on the agenda, but his work was criticized for maybe being applicable only to particular kinds of states in particular circumstances, but it really got the debate started, and it's been running really for the last 40 years since then. Then there was a second wave of writing in the 1990s and the early 2000s, really in the wake of the end of the Cold War, the European single market, global free trade, the WTA, and so on, arguing that small states could actually do better than large states, because in a free trading world, the economies of scale provided by large internal markets were no longer relevant. In a post-Cold War world, the security issue was not as acute as it had been, and that small states had the advantage of flexibility and the ability to adapt very quickly to external change. Now, that literature really ended up with a lot of statistical analyses. Some of it was based upon general abstract arguments. There's a book by Alessino and Swallow-Ade, I should say, entirely abstract, say under certain conditions one can imagine that small states could do quite well. A lot of stuff about ethnic homogeneity that I find completely unconvincing, frankly. There's also work by people like David Skilling, which is highly quantitative and does regression analyses about the size of countries against growth in GDP, aiming to come to conclusions, which is really far too general, but much liked by the Scottish Government and the SNP Sustainable Growth Commission. That debate really ran out of steam because it made far too much about the experience of states in general. It made far too much about dubious statistical analyses and didn't really explain exactly how and when and under what circumstances small states can do well in a globalized world. Now, all of this did point out that in conditions of free trade, national markets were no longer critical, maybe exaggerating that point. But apart from that, didn't really tell us very much about the diversity of the experiences of small states. And that's really where this third wave of writing comes in, about the differences between small states, getting down to individual states, comparing states and asking under what circumstances, with what policy combinations can small states prosper in a globalized world, also taking into account that we're no longer as complacently about the security situation as we were perhaps at the end of the Cold War, and that we know a little bit more about the effects of so-called globalization and the fragility of global markets. And it was a group of scholars from this tradition that my Norwegian colleague Harald Baldesheim and I got together a few years ago to do a little project about small states in the modern world. Here it is, here's the book. It's far too small and far too expensive for any individual to purchase. So this is not a publicity blurb. It's just giving you the rather nice jigsaw puzzle of a cover there, and drawing attention to the title, which is Small States in the Modern World, Vulnerabilities and Opportunities. And the idea is that small states do have opportunities, but they also have their own particular vulnerabilities. And the secret of success is how you balance these out, how you can exploit the opportunities while protecting yourself from the vulnerabilities, which are still there. And we point out that there are two things that are required for a small state to at least guide its own fortunes. We don't talk about sovereignty, we certainly don't talk about taking back control or illusory notions like that. But how can a small state manage its own affairs and achieve a degree of autonomy and self-government in conditions of globalization, where buffeted by international security systems in a world of large states and in a world where capital is mobile and economic fortunes are hostage to international trends and what the economists call exogenous shocks. So we noted that there are two things that are required. One is an external shelter, the external dimension, to protect the small state from vulnerabilities on the security side, on the economic side, and in other domains as well. One could talk about the environment and human rights. The two critical things are security in a world of large states and big alliances small states are vulnerable unless they're under some kind of security umbrella, and normally they are. This may involve joining a military alliance, such as NATO, or even maybe like Ireland, which frankly is free riding on NATO. So the security system has to be in place, not a hegemonic system that destroys the autonomy of the small state, but a shared security system. And the other is to do with economic security and a system provided by international regimes or supranational regimes like the European Union that protect the small state from predatory economic behavior by its larger neighbors, from protectionist policies, mercantilist policies, anti-competitive policies practiced by large powers, which is, of course, a particular issue these days when we're much less complacent about the existence of global free trade. And we know that global free trade is being challenged on many sides. And once again, the European Union could provide that as an example of an economic security system by providing a system of supranational regulation that doesn't just constrain states, but it also empowers states by restraining other states and providing for the possibility of maintaining, say, high degrees of social protection because your competitors are also subscribing to that system. It provides regulation of anti-competitive practices and so on. So the external shelter is critically important. It can take many forms, and we've just been talking about the difference between the EEA and the EU and so on. The second thing is the internal buffer or adjustment mechanism. That is, there has to be a mechanism whereby a small state can adapt to external shocks, exogenous shocks, as the economists call them. It can't control its own environment. It can't dictate the economic rules of the game. It has to accept externally imposed changes. It has to be, in some respects, a rule taker, but how it adapts to those rules are very much a matter for the state itself to determine. And there are different modes of adaptation. And we distinguish broadly between two modes. One is the market liberal mode. We choose that word for people who don't like the term neoliberalism because it's been overstretched and abused a great deal. But this is the idea that you've got to compete in global markets by becoming competitive. That weasel word competitiveness, which is then taken to cover particular kinds of economic policy, specifically low taxes in order to attract capital investment, deregulation. Similarly, the implications of low taxes are a slimmed down public sector, a minimal welfare state, rolling with the economic blows, that is, accepting steep economic cycles, booms and busts, which may, in the long run, deliver you high rates of GDP growth, but at the cost of highly cyclical behavior, because you're vulnerable to changes in your markets, in the markets of your neighboring countries, and global changes and regional changes and so on. Simply rolling with those and accepting recessions and booms in succession rather than trying to even these out. Accepting that this is accompanied by varying levels of employment, so high and low levels of employment, that it might be necessary to have a liberal economic and a liberal immigration strategy, that in boom times you attract labor in, and in difficult times migrant workers leave. Of course, politicians don't always tie market liberal policies with pro-immigration policies, but that is the logical conclusion of that. This is one mode of adaptation. It has its merits. People sometimes talk about the Singapore model, but everybody I've ever spoken to who's ever been to Singapore says Singapore is not like that at all, but it's an ideal type. The example we give is some of the Central and Eastern European countries, some of the Baltic states, Estonia in particular. You look at its economic cycles, they're extremely pronounced. It does very well on the economic growth indicators, but if you look at the fluctuations in economic activity, they're really quite extreme. That is one model of adaptation. The other model of adaptation is based upon high levels of social protection on a large state, on high taxation in order to finance it, on a large public sector, which is used as a mechanism of macroeconomic stabilization, as well as social protection. Very often active labor market policies to redeploy people in bust times, because you simply can't command markets. You have to adjust rapidly, and this can involve kind of Thatcherite policies of, which we're very familiar with in Scotland, of simply destroying the existing economic base and trying to build a new one. Or it can mean adjustment, economic transformation, while avoiding high levels of unemployment, while maintaining the skill base and so on. Active labor market policy as a feature here. Public spending conceptualized as not being somehow a burden on the productive economy, but as being part of the productive economy. The concept here is social investment, and a high commitment to consensus and long-term planning. Very often, this is accompanied by systems of social consultation, what we used to call corporatism. Very few countries have the old corporatist model anymore, but many countries do have models of consultation between business and labor and the state and civil society to try and agree on programs of transition without the huge costs imposed by massive unemployment as a mechanism of transition. These are ideal types. No country fits these perfectly, but the point we do make is that a country wanting an economic and social strategy to manage its affairs in the context of globalization needs to know what is consistent with what. You can't have a bit of Denmark and a bit of New Zealand like the SNP Sustainable Growth Commission wanted to have, because these things go together. Broadly speaking, we can think of the Nordic model, and somebody will immediately say all the Nordic countries are different. Yes, of course they're different, but they do have this in common, that they are high tax, high spending economies, that they do have traditions of consensus politics and social consultation, that other countries are in the other category quite clearly, and have their own models. One country that tried to combine the two was Ireland, and it wasn't terribly successful. It's now settled down into an economic model that depends on very, very high levels of external investments, such that its GDP and its GNP bear almost no relation to one another. Very steep economic cycles of boom and bust. That's their model. Whether it's sustainable in Europe, I don't know, because their taxation or policies are widely regarded as being predatory, because they attract by low tax levels a lot of companies that are really doing business somewhere else. So that really is what we argued. And then we look at a number of countries. We do have an Icelander in there. I've never been to Iceland myself, unfortunately. So I think all the other small countries of Europe except for Iceland. We tried this out in Sweden. We had a meeting in Sweden, and the Swedes say, how dare you call us a small country? We're the big boys in this neighborhood because we've got 8 million population. Norway only has 5 million. We then spent about half an hour discussing what we mean by small states, and agreed that there are many different measures of smallness, and we don't need to have a single one. It's population size, it is geographical area, is GDP. What they all have in common are these same patterns of vulnerabilities and opportunities. They don't command world markets. They are imposed upon by external circumstances, and they have different ways of adapting to them. Now, just to conclude, in the European context, I would argue, following what both Michael and Kirsty have said, that small states have enormous reasons to be in the European Union, because it provides precisely those mechanisms for adjustment and the external protection system, the external shelter. What it doesn't provide, of course, is the internal adjustment mechanisms, and different European countries have to decide on their own internal mechanisms. Scotland has had very little of a debate about this. There's been a great deal in the independence debate about the external dimension and what Scotland can do as an independent country. Very little about the experience of other countries in reforming their internal political and governance arrangements. so as to maintain an effective autonomy or a degree of control of their own affairs in a globalized world. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. That was fascinating. That was great. How you managed to sort of like capture several decades of academic debate about small states into 5 minutes. And I think that the this distinction between the external shelter and the internal adjustment buffer is really really interesting one, and we'll maybe pick up some of the aspects of that in the questions that have come into the chat into the Q&A. So maybe picking up on that is a question from David Hood, who suggests that it looks like Scotland will become independent and seek to rejoin the EU. Does the panel consider a route via EFTA first, EFTA as opposed to the EEA, I think, and then back into the EU to be a sensible move? Many are suggesting that the the EFTA may be a better place for Scotland anyway, but could this be a temporary halfway house before seeking to move it back into the EU? Kirsty, would you maybe take that one first, and then as Mike's just finished speaking?
I think I did say something on that already, but let me expand a bit. I think sometimes the debate in Scotland is rather confused on the EFTA and EEA option, because they are two separate things. The European Free Trade Area has Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland in it. And then the European Economic Area has 3 of those 4. It doesn't have Switzerland, and it has 27 EU member states. And as I said in my talk, nobody has actually joined the EEA since the those 3 core members chose to do that. And the European Free Trade Association would not offer Scotland very much. I mean, there are some joint EFTA trade deals, and the EFTA treaty says that countries who join EFTA should try to join those trade deals, but obviously you can't commit other countries around the world to doing that. And if the reason not to join the EU was to have a customs union with the rest of the UK, then that would already be contradictory. So I think that's one point. And secondly, I think people think if Scotland, or some people think, if Scotland could join EFTA, then it's somehow an easier route to the European Economic Area. But obviously to be in the EEA, which is effectively means being in the EU's single market, you've got to meet all the single market criteria, and you've got to get agreement of all the EEA member states, and there's 30 of them. There's the 3 EFTA ones, and there's the 27 EU member states. And I mean, a lot of the scenarios here depend when and if obviously, but you know, if Scotland went independent in 2 years' time, that's very different to going independent in 12 years' time, because in 12 years' time you could have diverged substantially from single market laws, whereas if you were independent in 2 years' time, it's probably a bit fast, 2 years maybe to a referendum and 2 years to the divorce. But you know, if you haven't diverged far from the EU single market, you could, as I've argued in various papers, you could potentially have negotiations with the EU relatively quickly. And as I said in my talk, the normal route here is that the EU and the Commission would negotiate with the applicant state an association agreement, which would open up gradually or quickly Scotland's access to that single market, to taking away trade barriers and so forth. And of course, no state, you've got Turkey is in a customs union, but not in the EEA. You've got Norway is in the EEA, but not in the customs union. And I think people think this is somehow faster and easier and more sensible, but it would still leave you with a major regulatory border to England and Wales. It would still leave you with a customs border to the EU, and I suspect it could leave you with the worst of both worlds.
Okay, thanks. Michael, do you want to come in? Is that EFTA? Is that the worst of both worlds?
Which Michael are you asking?
Sorry, I was distinguishing between Mike and Michael. So if you'd like to be Michael, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll be Michael. Yeah. I mean, I very much back of what Kirsty said. To be honest, I mean, as she said, I mean, Switzerland is in EFTA, but not in the EEA. And the relationship between the European Union and Switzerland is incredibly important. It's a major trading partner both ways. But the complexity of Switzerland's relationship with the EU has to be seen to be believed. Its individual agreements regularly renegotiated on virtually everything. The EEA is a simple model, but it does mean, and perhaps it works for us. And I didn't really commit myself in my presentation, but perhaps it works for Iceland. But it basically means that you are required to accept laws that you've had absolutely no say in agreeing. So, I mean, my personal view, and I'm an EU official, so of course I think being in the EU is fantastic. But my personal view also is that if you're going to be in the EEA, going the whole hog is actually better, because then you're around the table. You're actually not just a rule taker; you're a rule maker. So I would be very much in favour for a theoretical small country to join the EU rather than go via the EEA route. Previously, I think the EEA was a kind of a waiting room in a way, because Austria and Sweden and Finland were in there for a time before joining. But in terms of Scotland again, I mean, there are big issues here, because one of the difficulties for the EU we don't have an opinion on Scotland, and we can't have an opinion on Scotland, but we all know that there are countries in the European Union who would be very worried about that, because they are worried about parts of their state also looking for independence. So there's a whole bigger picture here. But as Kirsty says, at the moment, Scotland has the entire acquis communautaire, it has the entire body of European law, but who knows what the situation will be in a few years' time. So, but if I was to give a simple answer, my personal view is that joining the EU completely is far a better option. But of course, every country is different. Sorry, that's a bit wishy-washy, but there we are.
Everywhere is different. Mike, any thoughts on EFTA?
Well, I disagree with what the other two have said. Whenever I go to Norway and try and point out that they have to take policies they have no say in making, they say, we know that, we're perfectly well aware of that. This is a political compromise. We're divided 50-50, so we just live with it, but we don't try and justify it. And again, as Kirsty says, the normal mechanism for transition is an association or a pre-accession agreement. That's already there. That would probably happen. The difficulty, of course, with Scotland is that joining the EU would mean both a customs and regulatory border with the European Union, but also with the UK or the rest of the UK as part of a European border. Joining the EEA or EFTA wouldn't make very much difference to that. Sure, then you could have a customs-free arrangement with the rest of the UK, but you still have the regulatory border, as we know very well. We've seen how the free trade arrangement with the EU is panning out, and it's not panning out very well at all. And finally, if you're a small country, you get most influenced by being on the inside. You can be a semi-detached big country and try and throw your weight around. But if you're a semi-detached small country, you have the worst of both worlds. If you're a small country, you exercise influence by being in on everything. That is basically the position of Ireland, which has proved its European credentials by the way it's played the Brexit issue and shown that as playing as a loyal European player, they've got Europe on their side.
If I could just follow up what Mike said there, I mean, the key to being successful in the European Union is, you mustn't think of yourself as a small state. You must think of yourself as a small state that can build alliances elsewhere. It's all, I think it's fair to say that when countries join the EU, it takes a couple of years before they know how to do the EU. But once they learn, I mean, Ireland is the perfect example of a country that has got the absolute maximum out of the European Union by being very, very smart, not just trying to there's a tendency for big countries, certainly in the case of the UK, of thinking that it would stand alone and be the sort of naughty pupil in a way. But the way to succeed in the European Union is to successfully build alliances in favour of your interests, and Ireland has done that fantastically well.
Great, thanks. Okay, question now on more on the sectoral side. Question from Bill Roger, who says that fish, finance, and tourism have successively dominated the Iceland economy. He thinks Scotland's economy is structurally more diverse. Is that the key difference? Michael, would you like to maybe start on that, given your experience of Iceland? To what extent is as the sectoral dimension the key difference or the reason why Iceland has managed within the EEA?
Well, yeah, Iceland, I mean, basically Iceland has stayed out of the EU, or did stay out of the EU when it decided to stay out of the EU, primarily because of fish. So in a way, it's the other way around. It's the major national interest, the common thread throughout the history of Iceland as an independent state is that fisheries has always been the mainstay of the economy. It was overtaken by tourism, it was overtaken by financial services, but basically that is what it has based its wealth upon. And so it's a sort of negative effect. They decided not to join because they were afraid for their fish, I suspect. I don't know much about the Scottish economy, but I think in a way a country like Iceland would actually be better protected within the European Union because its economy is so narrow. I talked about the currency issue, and I think the main argument that pro-Europeans have in Iceland is that the euro would just bring so much more stability to the Icelandic economy and probably allow it to diversify. But I think that the fact that it has got a very narrowly based economy, being within the European Union, probably would cushion it, in fact, better from shocks than it is cushioned in its current position, I think, speaking as a non-economist.
Kirsty, do you want to add something there?
Sure. I mean, Scotland's obviously a bigger population and therefore not just bigger, but more diverse economy. And at the moment, sadly, because of Brexit, we're getting an object lesson in what putting customs and non-tariff barriers up means and does across all sorts of different sectors, from the food and drink sector to fish to tourism to universities to a whole range of other services. And of course, during the Brexit debate, fisheries was one of the kind of sensitive, neuralgic issues, even though it's a small part of the UK economy, slightly bigger, but still small of the Scottish economy. But there was a huge amount of posturing from Boris Johnson, and then some big part of the fishing communities were very surprised when in fact he struck a deal with the EU. I wasn't at all surprised that he struck a deal with the EU that wasn't particularly advantageous to the fishing communities, because the Commission, Michel Barnier and others, have been very clear from the start, and that they basically had a mantra that there was no access to markets without access to waters. And so it's not only that, yes, it wouldn't make sense for an independent Scotland to make its choices, it would need to make its choices across all sectors of the economy, and also what happens within those sectors. Again, I mentioned the west of Scotland seafood fishermen, who've been so shatteringly badly hit since the start of January. And so on top of that diverse economy point, I think you mustn't forget, the EU is an immensely powerful actor and trade negotiator. If Scotland went independent, the EU would actually have to some extent, renegotiate its current new deal, bad deal for the UK, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, because it includes fishery, and you'd be taking the Scottish population, the Scottish economy, and Scottish fish out of that. But the idea that Scotland could somehow just imitate Norway, and that Scotland could say, well, we're going to be in your single market, but we're going to be really, really hard-nosed on fish. There's got to be a bargain here. There's got to be agreement. And this is why what we were talking about earlier about not misunderstanding EFTA and how you join the EEA, I think is also important in those discussions.
Thanks, Kirsty. Mike, I don't know if you want to add anything there. If not, there is a question that's kind of more specifically directed at you.
Well, just 2 points there. Scotland's economy is indeed quite diversified, but two salient things: it's highly dependent on external investment. Not as much as Ireland, but or indeed as much as Wales, but this does imply the need to maintain access to European markets and the European investment. And secondly, on the internal side, the weakness of the Scottish economy is the lack of small and medium-sized firms and the inability to develop small firms into medium-sized firms. That is a vulnerability and something that would need to be attended to in independent Scotland.
Could I just follow up on what Kirsty said very briefly? I mean, the point she made about trade and trade negotiations is very, very, very important. What I found rather peculiar and rather amusing was the way that the United Kingdom was apparently leaving the European Union in order to become a great free trading power. What I couldn't understand, I mean, the European Union is the biggest single market in the world. It's 500 million people. It is massively, massively strong in international trade negotiations, far stronger than a single country can ever be. And if you look at the history of the last 5 years, the number of deals that the European Union has struck, and when you look at the deals that the UK has struck since leaving, they simply mirror the European Union deals. So, I mean, I think the idea of being outside of the European Union because you want to become a great free trading nation is simply wrong, because the European Union has enormous power. The European Union can negotiate with the US on a trade arrangement as an equal partner. That would not be possible for a single country like the United Kingdom. There would be far more pressure. So being within the EU gives you so much more trading power than being outside.
Yep. Okay. An interesting question here, I think, essentially directed at Mike from Corentin Courchaud. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. And he's looking for you to expand a bit more on the pros and cons of the two models that the two models of adaptation that you outlined, the low tax liberal versus the high tax social for an independent Scotland. What would be the pros and cons of the different ones?
Well, this is a matter of political judgment. I think that market liberal one simply wouldn't sell in Scotland. And indeed, we've seen in the Brexit debate that at the start of the Brexit debate, when Cameron started it going, it was all about deregulation, wasn't it? And free trade, even unilateral free trade, that's it. That's completely disappeared now, because the benefits of unilateral free trade are not obvious at all. And because the support base of the pro-Brexit side very often is precisely in people in very vulnerable economic and social positions. And we've got all this levelling up and industrial policy come back again. So that's not going to work even on a UK level. It's simply not going to work at a Scottish level. But the idea that I'm criticising is that it could somehow have the best of both worlds, that you could have all the social protections, but at the same time have all this advantage of a low tax economy or be able, as Michael was just saying, be able to negotiate your own free trade deals. That's for the fairies. That's simply not going to happen. Now, of course, it depends on whether you're on the right or the left politically, whether you're a social democrat or not. I'll give my own views. I come from the social democratic side of the political spectrum, and I like that model more. But the other is a perfectly legitimate choice to be made. But people would have to be explicit. That is what they're offering. And that's the implication of it. Yes, you get low taxes, but you get low services as a result of it. Yes, you get economic booms, but you get economic busts as well. That's a matter of philosophy, but don't think you can combine the two.
Okay, so unlike the Leave argument, you've got to say what kind of model you're going to go for before you get a vote for it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. Another interesting question here from Niall Ogilvie. Is there an argument that Scotland is a small country would be able to exert greater influence in the European model than it has been able to have in the UK. Who'd like to take that on first? Kirsty, please go ahead.
I think, I mean, it's a very good question. My first thought and instinctive reaction is yes, for all the reasons I've explained in terms of both the way the whole system has been structured and evolved down the years to try and give a balance between different size states in the EU with different interests, and they've all had to agree every time there's treaty change, they've had to agree that. And then on top of that, the way all these different alliances, networks and influence routes operate too, and not least, I mean, I think we've not put it this explicitly, but it used to be something that was said all the time in EU seminars, that the European Commission was seen as kind of the friend and supporter of the smaller states, because there were more smaller states and it was meant to be trying to defend the European interest as a whole. Of course, that question opens up a whole set of other issues around how the UK is structured and the devolved assemblies and parliaments and the consultation mechanisms, which I think in the Joint Ministerial Committee, which Michael can talk about more than me, but I think has worked particularly badly in terms of Brexit, and also has depended very much on whether there's political goodwill or lack of goodwill in London towards the devolved administrations. Because although when people talk about federalism in the UK, people talk a lot about the asymmetry problem, because England is 85% of the population, and you haven't got any asymmetry exactly like that in the EU. But Scotland's a bigger bit of the UK's bigger share of the UK's population than it would be of the EU. So I mean, at one level, it's quite extraordinary that that's my initial thought and response, is that you'd actually, if you're comparing existing EU structures of influence and existing UK structures of influence, that I nonetheless think Scotland would have a bigger voice, but also it would be having a voice in a bigger, more powerful body.
If I could come in there, I think, as I said earlier, I think it depends on your ability to learn how to operate in the EU system, build alliances. I also think Scotland, or any other country joining, would be helped by the fact that the EU is, I mean, it is a completely different way of doing business. It's a consensual way of doing business rather than the rather strange oppositional sort of shouty tradition we have in the UK politics. And also, frankly, I mean, Scotland would actually be relatively big amongst the small in the European Union context. Its population is considerably larger than many, many member states. So it's a hypothetical situation, but my answer would be probably yes.
Mike, do you want to add anything, particularly in light of what you've just been writing about?
Just to say that, yes, as Kirsty said, the arrangements for Scotland influencing EU policy were not terribly satisfactory. The Joint Ministerial Committee on Europe was the only one that actually worked, but whether Scotland was able to make its influence felt is another matter. On the other hand, the EU internal market did allow Scotland a great deal more devolution than it's going to enjoy now that the EU internal market has been replaced by a much more constraining UK internal market provision. And within the EU single market and within European regulation, Scotland in devolved areas had as much discretion in applying those regulations as a member state. So that this did allow for the development of the devolution settlement. What's happened since the Brexit vote is a lot of those things have simply gone back to Westminster without the kind of protections that exist in Europe about subsidiarity and proportionality that prevent undue centralisation of power.
Great, thanks. A question that's partly related to that comes from Alison Hunter, who asks that, given the current approach of the UK government, what are the chances of rather rapid divergence, e.g. financial services is already on the way, and how will this influence Scotland's EU ambitions? So I guess, you know, if the UK diverges, then how does that affect Scotland's ability then to converge with EU rules in the future? Who'd like to take that on first? Kirsty, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it follows on from what Michael's just said. Thanks for the question, Alison. I know you can answer it as well as I can. It depends. It does very much depend on what happens with the UK internal market. Although in some ways, I always struggle to say UK anymore in these sorts of discussions, because obviously Northern Ireland is actually basically in the single market for goods and in the EU customs union. So a lot of the time we're talking about England, Wales and Scotland. So Boris Johnson is busy recreating the UK internal market and centralising power in London at the same time as he's fragmented and put a barrier in that market as well. Of course, the Scottish government has said that in devolved areas it wants to remain aligned to EU laws in as far as it can, not least in environmental laws. But obviously that doesn't cover everything. And as Michael's just said, some of the debates, over the last 3 years as Brexit happened has been about how many powers have gone back to London. And so that will make it harder to remain aligned. But I think, I think this is very much a question of timing. As I said before, if Scotland was trying to rejoin in 4 years or in 14 years, that is a difference. And despite the financial services example, and it links to things all three of us, I think, have said on this panel, even a relatively large state like the UK, I mean, it's medium-sized in global terms, it can't really go away and set all its own regulations. A lot of EU regulations become, accepted global level ones, and the three main power blocks economically, the US, Europe, and China, or Southeast Asia. UK, it may revert, although as Michael says, that discussion about deregulation has rather gone by the board for the moment. But even with the shock of both Brexit and the pandemic to cross-border supply chains, trade is not going to stop. It's not going to make any sense for the UK to have, two different production lines inside companies if we're thinking about goods companies, not services companies. So yes, of course that is a risk, and the effect of it would be, of divergence, would be to slow down the rejoining process. But I mean, the EU has never had a potential candidate country like Scotland. It's never had a state that had been in the EU for 47 years trying to rejoin. So if you look at it compared to the current candidate countries in Western Balkans, obviously for now, Scotland looks much better placed, even though it's not imminent.
Yeah. Mike, do you want to add something to that?
Yes, we don't know where the UK is going to end up in regulatory divergence. I suspect we'll get the worst of both worlds. That is, we'll end up adopting something that looks like the EU regulations for all the reasons that Kirsty has given, without having guaranteed access to the market, because officially we'll be trying to diverge. And as far as Scotland is concerned, similarly, the Scottish government is trying to stay within European regulations in devolved areas, but that has really been probably fatally undercut by the UK Internal Market Act, which means that were Scotland to adopt more stringent regulations, there'd be nothing to stop goods imported into England simply crossing the border in Scotland and selling at a lower cost. That really has upset the whole balance of the devolution settlement, really. I suspect that on environmental policy, the UK will be a good international performer. I see no reason why they should go in for environmental deregulation. I'm not sure about the social dimension. I think that's something that's going to divide the Tory party very seriously between those who still want to go back to the Thatcherite agenda and those who want to keep their seats in the Red Wall districts. And we don't know how that's going to work out.
Okay. Michael, did you want to add anything?
I'll just be very brief. I mean, I think as Kirsty said, I mean, this would be a unique situation, and even with divergence, which would make it more difficult, the level of divergence would be far less serious than in previous negotiations with Eastern European former communist states, for example. So, you know, it's a problem, but it's a not insurmountable one. We've done many negotiations with many tricky customers in the past.
Yep. Still a problem for a Scottish border with the rest of the UK, of course, if that divergence emerges. Okay, we're coming up. I'm just going to pick a couple of questions from the end, because we're coming up against our time limit, and these are both about the new US administration and about what the impact is likely to be in terms of deregulation away from EU norms. Do you have any sense of what pressures that might cause and where that might end up? Mike, do you want to start with that? You have long experience of being in North America.
Yeah. Well, with all the relief at the departure of Trump, people have assumed that Biden, in all respects, will be better for us and for Europe. But on trade, the Biden administration could be in many ways tougher than a Trump administration, because there is in the Democratic Party a protectionist lobby there. They're very suspicious about free trade deals. Getting free trade deals through Congress could be extremely difficult. There's particular sensitivity, of course, about the Irish issue, the Irish border question, and the British government might have done to upset that. So that I would expect that the UK government is not going to have an easy ride negotiating a free trade deal with the United States, and that the European Union would probably get a much better deal than we would.
Mm-hmm. Kirsty.
Oh, well, I agree with that. It's obviously, it might have been well, not exactly a priority for Trump, but it might have been part of his sort of way of thinking about friends and enemies, that he might have wanted to show to Boris Johnson he'd give him some sort of trade deal. But Biden is a different, fortunately for everybody, a different politician, and he's not only very concerned about and aware of Ireland, but I mean, he didn't think Brexit was a good idea. The relationship with the EU is more important. Of course, the relationship with the UK remains important. But I think so. I mean, yes, if there was a deal, it could be difficult, both because of the power of the US and because the deal wouldn't have to upset the pre-existing EU-UK deal. And at the moment we see, including in the Northern Ireland Protocol, as well as at the UK-EU border elsewhere, a lot of the problematic issues are the UK not aligning with EU health and animal and plant and phytosanitary sanitary rules. So, for instance, if that changed for the better, Johnson might not do that, different government in 2 or 3 years might. That will also make a US deal more difficult. So I don't think a deal is in the offing. It's not a priority. It's not of great interest to the US. And if those talks started, it's going to be very complicated, and it will expose even more than we've seen in the last 3 months how squeezed the UK will be between those two big trade blocs, both of whom should be its allies. But your allies aren't always your allies when it comes to hard-nosed trade talks.
Sure. Michael, would you like to have the last word before we
I better be
wrap
brief.
up?
I see we're running out of time. I mean, I would only say that the UK government's own figures before the Brexit deal was done and dusted showed that even a fabulous, in theory, trade deal with the US wouldn't go anywhere near replacing the lost trade and the losses from leaving the single market. So a rational approach would be to look to align more with the European Union than with the US, but we're not in rational times, perhaps, and there is a sort of certain amount of, there's a political process going on and a sort of a difficult period. But also the point I made earlier as well, I mean, in terms of leverage in negotiations with the US, you know, does the European Union have more leverage, or does the United Kingdom on its own? I mean, I think that's a pretty easy question to answer. So, but obviously, as a European, I would advocate that Britain stays as close as possible, but that's not my prerogative. So, thank you.
Yeah, that's another dimension of the small state argument, I think, isn't it? Really. Okay, well, we do have to wrap it up there now. So I'd like to say a huge thanks to our speakers tonight. Thank you very much for sharing your insights and expertise with us. It's been absolutely fascinating. And thanks to the audience for your questions. I hope I managed to pick up most of them directly or indirectly along the way. And I think David Gow answered one or two in writing as well in the background. Just a few final things. After the event, you'll get an email to give us some feedback on the session, what you'd like to hear from future events, and how you think this one went. Also, if you're not a member of the European movement in Scotland, please do go onto the website and have a look around and hopefully join up. And you'll also see that there are local groups that cover almost the entirety of Scotland, and that are campaigning for, on a non-party political basis, for closer relations with the EU. Couple of final things. 24th of May, we have a webinar on Ireland with former TSUC John Bruton, Bridget Laffin from European University Institute, and I think Tony Connolly from RTE, and many of you will recognise all of those names, and that'll be chaired by David Clark from EMiS. And then sometime in June, Kirsty will be back chairing a session with, well, I give him his official title, I think, the EU ambassador to the UK, João Vale de Almeida. So that's something very much to look forward to as well. The date's not yet confirmed. So thank you, everybody, for signing up and tuning in, and looks forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Bye.